Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Now, a few years ago, a book came out. A book was published by Dr. Ken Berry, and it was called Lies My Doctor Told Me. I was fascinated, obviously, by the titles. I purchased the book as soon as it was published. I read it back to back in the space of a few days. And it exposed me to the lies that dominate our healthcare system. The healthcare industry, maybe, is a better way to call it. And a few weeks ago, when I spotted the title of a new upcoming book, and the title is Lies I Taught in Medical School, written by a professor of medicine, author of over 200 peer-reviewed papers, contributor of several articles and chapters to different publications, I was naturally intrigued. I wanted to find out more, and I wanted to find out what this professor has been teaching his students for decades, which he now realizes were lies. So I'm honored to have him with us today, Dr. Robert Lufkin. Welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Oh, thanks, Nayiri. It's such an honor to be on your program. I've enjoyed listening to your podcasts, and the work you're doing is amazing. So it's great to be here.
That means a lot to me. So thank you very much, Dr. Lufkin. Dr. Lufkin, we are going to talk at least about some of those lies which you've been teaching to your students. But before we do that, can you tell our audience a little bit more about your professional background? Where did you study? What did you specialize in? And what did you teach?
Sure, absolutely. And before I do that, if I may, I want to shout out to Dr. Ken Berry, who wrote that amazing book. He's one of my heroes. And the book I'm doing now is hopefully will honor the book he's done, because he's an inspiration and doing great work. And I recommend everyone looking at his video channel and his books. He has a new book coming out as well, too, I think. But my background is, it's interesting. I started out even before medical school. I was raised in a family where my mom was a professional dietitian. So she was a nutritionist, and she worked in hospitals, and was in touch with the best, presumably the optimal teaching for what to eat and what not to eat. So we religiously followed her instructions, and avoided saturated fats. We avoided cholesterol. We switched out high fat foods for low fat foods, which were typically high sugar foods. We switched out butter for margarine, which contained trans fats back then, and then later on seed oils. We used canola oil instead of saturated fat. So we did all those things. And I was, through the process, maybe I grew interested in medicine and how the human body worked, and I eventually went to college and medical school, and just loved the whole thing. In fact, I continued on in the area I focused in after getting my medical degree was in medical imaging or radiology. And the thing I liked about that specialty is that as a radiologist, one has to be able to interact with all different specialists. So when I talk to the neurosurgeon, I have to, discuss brain tumor anatomy and things that I see on the images, or, a neurologist discuss Alzheimer's disease, or with a cardiologist, we talk about the calcifications we see in the coronary arteries and, the heart disease issues. And with an endocrinologist, we talk about the complications of diabetes and those things. So it was a particularly fun specialty, exciting specialty for me, because it combined a diverse knowledge of many different specialties. So instead of like an ophthalmologist will focus very deeply on the eye and even a portion of the eye like the retina. As a radiologist, you have to be a generalist and be able, although you're an expert in imaging, you have to be able to image many different areas, which I enjoyed. I loved doing my residency. I stayed on and did a fellowship in neuroradiology and head and neck radiology. And I liked it so much, I just never left. I joined the faculty immediately at UCLA, where I worked for essentially my entire career, and had a great time and continue to have a great time seeing patients. First of all, as part of my practice, I had a clinical practice where I saw patients, prescribe drugs, that sort of thing, and also interpret their images, which I still do. In addition to the practice of medicine, I also did research. So I did a lot of research, took a lot of money from drug companies and the government, and my lab was funded on the order of millions of dollars for research. So I'm part of the medical establishment, really. But the best part of my job was and is teaching residents and medical students and other doctors. And because as many teachers will appreciate, we often learn more from our students than we impart to them, just by the questions they ask and the whole experience of teaching. So that's where I've been over the last. That's kind of my background in medicine.
So for a professor of your caliber, with a rich career, something must have triggered you to stand back and question the material that you were teaching, or the truthfulness of the material you were teaching your students. Because it's easy as a retired teacher myself, I know we tend to teach the same material over and over again, year after year. We don't have the time to stand back and look at the value or even the truthfulness of the material in your case. What was that moment of revelation for you, if you like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, everything was going well for me. I was doing the teaching, I was doing the clinical practice, and I was doing original research. As you mentioned, as you referenced, I participated in writing original research papers and peer-reviewed grants and that sort of thing. But for me personally, the point changed when I began developing some chronic diseases. So I got hypertension, high blood pressure, and was prescribed a medicine for that, which is standard practice. I developed abnormal blood lipids, dyslipidemia, which I was prescribed another drug for that. And I developed gout, which is an arthritis, an acute arthritis of the joints, and I was prescribed a medicine for that. And my blood sugar was slightly elevated in what was called the pre-diabetic range, but I was on the course to developing diabetes. Now, knowing what I knew at the time, I thought, well, my father had many of these diseases, and he actually died of a heart attack and stroke, but he was much older than I was. And at the time I began getting these diagnoses, I still had two daughters that weren't even teenagers yet. And I'm thinking, wow, this is hitting home. You know, I want to be around for them. I want to be a parent. And about that same time, I just happened to have a friend who was a science writer who was interested in writing about bad science. And he had it was well known for work he'd done about writing about problems with physics research and Nobel laureates in physics, but he had just switched to the area of nutrition and was starting to write about that. His name's Gary Taubes, and he's written some landmark books on the subject. And he was one of the first authors I started reading, and his work and many other people that have followed him and in the same line raised some questions about what I had been teaching and what I had been taught, and my overall global view of the way disease worked. And I began to investigate it, and gradually came to some conclusions that were different than I'd had for the last few decades of work there.
Well, your personal story is almost the story of every man. mid 40s, 50s, being diagnosed with chronic illnesses, one after the other, and ending up on a number of medications for chronic illnesses, which we now know are preventable. That's the story of every man. Everyone I look around, everyone I see around me is in that same boat. So, and I think what I see wrong in our society is that most people, and you might disagree with me, but most people that at least I come across see it as normal and put it down to age. Well, okay, so hypertension, well, you're in your 40s now, so, it's not unnatural. Gout, well, again, no one really questions what's causing the gout. Arthritis, oh, okay, well, grandma also had arthritis, so it's probably genetic. We tend to normalize ill health and reliance on medication. And I think that makes it very difficult to change, to become a healthier society. What do you think? Any comments on that?
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's very dangerous, the situation we're in now. In the United States, more than half of the adult population is either overweight or obese. So it's almost normal to be overweight. Over half the population has diabetes or prediabetes of the adult population in the United States. Over half the population has fatty liver disease. So these things are becoming so common that, like you say, they're almost being accepted. It's okay to be overweight. Maybe it's not okay, but it's part of life to be that way. And I think that's a mistaken conclusion. And these chronic diseases that we see increasing, in my opinion, are not necessarily the inevitable results of aging, but have other deeper metabolic factors that, fortunately, we can control with our lifestyle and the choices that we make in our lives. It's not just that, my father had those diseases, so I just wait until I get them and, do it that way. But unlike my father, I at least have the awareness that there are things I can do in my life that I believe, and that I think my patients can do also, that will change their risk for getting these diseases and can actually prevent the diseases and reverse them if they have them, for some of them.
And I think the education we're providing to wider audience through various social media platforms, and the efforts you're putting into educating people, and your upcoming book, are all helpful in in creating that big sort of global change. And you did mention of overweight and of numbers of overweight and obese people in the United States, but it is a global phenomenon. It was the same. I mean, I'm from the UK. It's the same in the UK. Now I've been living in Mexico I've been here now 3 months. I see at least 80% of people around me as overweight or obese. So it is a global phenomenon. So all the efforts you're putting out there and the little effort that I'm putting in, spreading the information, the correct information, I think does make a difference, or would like to believe makes some difference.
Yeah, I have to believe that if people are given the knowledge, if they're given the awareness, and they know the choice, that a given choice is going to have a certain impact in their life, that people will not make that choice. Most people won't. I think beforehand, I mean, I was always told, and even my mom, the dietitian, told me to eat the right foods. Eating right is important. But I think our understanding of what is right and what is harmful with diet has changed dramatically. And so it's a matter of educating people that the dietary choices actually do matter and there are significant effects. It's not like sugar's a problem because it's going to make you gain pounds and give you cavities in your teeth. Sugar's a problem because it's going to give you diabetes, type 2 diabetes, at risk for that. It's going to increase your risk for heart attacks, metabolic syndrome. It's going to increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease, fatty liver, arthritis, and certain types of cancer even. I think if people were aware of the dangers of some of these foods, processed foods particularly, like I said, the sugars, the refined carbohydrates, and the refined seed oils. With that knowledge, I think people would make a decision for themselves. And I think that people just aren't aware of how harmful these things are.
You did mention metabolic. Well, you often talk about metabolic dysfunction. So what is metabolic? How would you define it? Metabolic dysfunction. And what can we do about it?
Great question. I mean, when I went to medical school, and I think for a long time, metabolism, we always thought of metabolism as just the way the body processes food, which is true, but I've come to realize that metabolism is much more than that. It's basically, it's the underlying mechanism that controls almost everything and drives all the major chronic diseases we've talked about. And metabolism is even, in my opinion, the driver of aging. And the drugs that are being discovered, revolutionary drugs in the last decade or two, that are transforming the way we think about longevity and aging, the way these drugs all work is by changing our metabolism, particularly very specific pathways that have to do with nutrient sensing and glucose. And there's one protein called MTOR that senses insulin, it senses growth factors, it senses a number of different things, and it controls metabolism through this. And having mTOR turned on or turned down can have dramatic effects, not only on our longevity, but essentially all of these chronic diseases. And we can influence proteins like mTOR and these other signaling molecules like insulin and growth factors by the lifestyle choices that we make. In fact, the lifestyle choices we make are much more effective than any particular drug in treating these chronic diseases.
Now you mentioned mTOR. It's not part of my question. I wasn't going to talk about mTOR, but I'm fascinated. And I think most people are afraid of, protein and how protein or excess protein might trigger mTOR, which then, would sort of spur growth, which then may lead, and this is what people say, may lead to, cancer and early aging. Can you clarify that for us? Because I know that is not the truth, and I've listened to many sort of specialists out there talking about mTOR, and in fact they also mention fasting and how fasting has an influence on mTOR as well. Can you clarify that for us?
Sure. Yeah, mTOR is very exciting. It's a little confusing though. Let me clarify it. mTOR is this protein that, when it turns on, it turns up anabolism or growth. It's a growth signaling molecule. When we have a lot of food, mTOR is turned on and it tells the body to grow. And growing triggers a couple things. Cell proliferation, which means the cells grow and we get bigger and bigger. If we have a lot of food, we want to proliferate. The other thing it triggers is inflammation. When we have a lot of food coming into our body, it's through ingesting the food, and any food in our body through the GI tract is absorbed into our system. And with that, there's always a risk for foreign material being absorbed. And that's why we need to dial up inflammation when we're eating. So mTOR does cell proliferation, and it turns up inflammation. The other thing it does, the third thing, is when we have a lot of food on hand, it's more food than we can consume typically. So we want to store it and put it into storage. And to do that, we turn on a hormone called insulin, which causes glucose to be stored as fat, causes the body to take up and store fat and glycogen, a small amount, but largely fat. So those are the three things that mTOR really does. It turns up cell proliferation, cell growth, which is great when you have a lot of food. And then it turns up inflammation because you want to protect your body from all this food coming in case any bad stuff gets in with the food, which is good. It's a healthy response. And then finally, the last thing we mentioned also is we want to turn up the storage mechanisms to store all this extra food for a rainy day. And that's great. The problem people have pointed out with mTOR is that in the past, and I mean the human past, and by the past I mean pre-agricultural humans, more than 12,000 years ago, most experts believe that humans were hunter-gatherers there, and our meals were infrequent with large periods of fasting between the meal. That would mean that a protein like mTOR is turned on when we have a lot of food, we cell proliferate, we do those three things. And then the rest of the time when we're not eating, we're essentially fasting, there's no food, and mTOR is turned off. When mTOR is turned off, those three things sort of invert. We dial down inflammation. So we turn off inflammation or turn it down because we don't need it anymore. We turn down cell proliferation because we don't have food. We don't want to proliferate cells. And then we don't want to store food either. We don't want to store fat. In fact, we do just the opposite. When mTOR is turned down, we burn fat and we use ketones and this sort of thing that you may have talked about to your audience before. And then finally, one important thing when mTOR is turned down, we begin to recycle things. We salvage things. It's called autophagy, where if we don't have food coming in, we look around the house and there's an old piece of furniture, we'll use that for something else, and we'll trigger autophagy, which is a good thing. So the problem with modern society is by the diet we choose and the fact that we always eat frequent meals throughout the day, mTOR is turned on nearly all the time with us, and we're always in cell proliferation mode, fat storage mode, and inflammation mode. And all those three factors can drive all the chronic diseases we've mentioned. So one of the targets of metabolic health is having a more balanced activation of mTOR, turned on sometimes, turned off sometimes. Now, back to your question, I'm sorry for the long answer, but you asked about protein and mTOR. So things that turn on mTOR are specifically things like glucose and insulin. Protein turns on mTOR a smaller amount because proteins turn on, as you know, insulin a little bit less than glucose, and fats don't really activate things much at all. Most of the dietary strategies, though, that people are talking about to improve metabolic health, in my opinion, the most effective ones are not to change the protein concentration, but rather to play with the other two macronutrients. As you've probably talked with your guests, there are three macronutrients: protein, fat, and carbohydrates. So I think the most effective strategy for improving metabolic health and turning down mTOR is to substitute, increase the fats and decrease the carbohydrates, but keep protein relatively constant. In that effect, you'll be turning down mTOR, but you don't have to worry about the effects of the protein on the mTOR necessarily.
Great explanation. Thank you very much for that. I think it's the first time we're discussing mTOR on my channel, certainly. You did mention prolongevity. Now, that's an area that interests you. When I happened to mention the word in a completely different context, but I had the word in a written text in one of my Facebook groups, I remember a few comments, or they were the most common comments. So what is prolongevity? Is it just living longer? It's not just about, living up to 100, is it? What is prolongevity? Because who wants to live up to 100 if you're going to spend 35 years in a wheelchair and unable to perform your daily needs? Yeah.
Well, I guess the first clarification is when people talk about extending lifespan, it's implied that you're really extending health span, which is the healthy years. Because as you say, if we add another 10 years of our lives in a nursing home, again, no judgment for nursing homes, but or in a severe disability, that is not as appealing as 10 years of life with better health. So it's about extending the healthy years of our lives. I've only recently become interested in longevity, part of it because I'm getting really old, but also because as I studied these chronic diseases that the ones I've mentioned here in the list and the 4 that I happen to get, they all have this basis in metabolic abnormalities, Alzheimer's, cancer, all of these things. And what also became clear that I wasn't aware of before is that the same metabolic factors that we use to decrease our risk of getting these diseases and actually reverse these diseases are the same things that individuals use as longevity strategies to actually delay aging or prolong longevity. And it turns out it's really the same mechanism. And indeed, aging is the strongest risk factor for all chronic diseases. It's even worse than cigarette smoking for lung cancer is age is a bigger risk factor. So something about aging or living a long time drives these chronic diseases. And as it turns out, there's certain metabolic factors that accumulate in people over time that increase our risk for all these metabolic diseases and actually drive aging. And there's a theory of aging that I used to think, and I was taught in medical school, that aging and longevity is sort of like your car wearing out. Everything in the world wears out, right, over time. It just gets old. But I don't think that anymore. And there's a growing revolution in longevity research, even in mainstream research, that longevity is programmed, that cell death is programmed at a certain time. And that's why humans live a certain length of time, but primates live another length of time. And there's great variety in the lifespan of certain species. But even more revolutionary, there's certain genes that people could found in animals and even in mammals that when they changed the genes, their lifespan increased by 30%. Or significantly affected their lifespan. And this is the really exciting area of what's going on with longevity, because if we do these lifestyle things that improve our risk for these chronic diseases, there's very strong evidence that they actually will improve our aging and reduce other phenotypes or signs of aging that we have in our bodies.